Every year, global leaders of major economies gather under the G20 summit to discuss global issues. This year, the summit will be held in South Africa with a focus on economic inequality, development, climate change, and fair trade practices.
Having the summit on the African continent that is vulnerable to climate change impacts will provide a unique opportunity for Africa to influence global economies to fund its climate actions.
Namibia, which is one of Africa's semi-arid countries and has a population of 1.8 million people highly relying on agriculture, is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Hence, a summit such as this creates an opportunity for the country to benefit in climate funding.
The manager of corporate communications at the Environmental Investment Fund is positive that Namibia, as a developing country, can leverage from the funding windows available at the G20 summit to implement its national determined contributions. With a focus on the country's adaptation measures in the areas of smart agriculture, water, energy, environmental sustainability, and reversing land degradation.
In Namibia, we have new sectors that are emerging. I think those sectors are in the form of green hydrogen, but also oil and gas. So these sectors are important. There is a need to invest in the sustainability of these sectors. Remember, as Namibia seeks um, to have its economic or achieve its economic goals, we need to ensure that every economic sector is sustainable. So we are already a vulnerable country in terms of our environment, and also we are vulnerable in terms of the impact of climate change. So it is important that we get funding.
Now, the country has a very ambitious NDC of wanting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 91% by the year 2030 at a cost of $77 billion. This means that an individual Namibian will cost government about $25,000 to overcome the impacts of climate change.
Of the $77 billion, about $66 billion will be used for mitigation measures and $30 billion for adaptation measures. However, over the past 10 years, the country has only been able to source $4 billion, translating to 5% of what it needs from entities such as the Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, Special Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund. This leaves Namibia with only 5 years to mobilize $74 billion by the year 2030.
Is more than 100 times more than our gross domestic product. Therefore, 90% of this amount is actually to be sourced from international donors, which is your international support agency, your multilateral development banks, your philanthropists, which are international private institution, your Green Climate Fund, your global environmental facilities, and your adaptation fund. While 10% is a commitment that we have made that our national domestic budget is going to be of support towards our NDC.
Amutanya says at the G20 summit, Namibia should not only focus on sourcing funding for large scale green energy projects, but also for small scale projects that are at the grassroots level, saying they too play a critical role among the communities they serve.
Cases where funding is limited, like let's say, especially now that we have the US having pulled out from the climate policies, it's becoming quite scarce to get investments in climate finance projects, or just youth-led activities. And in these cases where funding has been made limited or scarce, the focus can be directed to more flagged projects, like green hydrogen, that can steal a lot of attention from international donors, and where most of the investments goes into assessments and feasibility studies in the taking off of the plant. And then obviously these small projects at community level can be overlooked, not entirely because they are not important, but because of the momentum of such large projects that they can take on.
But the question is, how can developed nations be held accountable to ensure that funding agreed on and advocated for at international platforms such as the G20 summit does reach the developing nations?
Journalist and foreign correspondent for the Daily Maverick, Peter Fabricius, says this duty rests with the journalists.
The answer has to be that journalists, African journalists, have to stay on the case and regularly check that to ensure that the industrialized countries are sticking to their promises. We all tend to report and then move on. We report the big announcements and then move on. There will be an opportunity to do this at and after the COP30 in Azerbaijan in November this year, when the $100 billion pledge is likely to be increased considerably.
Now, as the momentum builds up towards the meeting of the world's economic powerhouses is rising, concerns about how the USA has been playing its cards around the summit are also rising, with potential climate funding shortfalls being a concern. But all in all, with 5 months to go, anything can happen or change. For Business Today, Julana Fuka, Bantuk.